Okay, hi everybody. This is Coach Douthitt, and I'm speaking for Coach Douthitt and Coach Green. Um, I hope everybody is doing well in the face of what we're trying to do. And it's a pretty tough time. It's a tough time for a lot of kids, I would say, especially for you guys that are seniors. If you're in especially, I think, a spring sport or even I think most of our winter sports were over before everything came down, but just terrible. But here we go. We're going to get through this, and we're going to just keep it very basic, and keep rolling. So we're going to start with chapter 1 today, which is Tuesday, and we will do section 2, which will be a little bit shorter on Thursday, and that will be all that we do for chapter 1. So we're kind of going to get into it, and we're just going to basically, chapter 1, section 1 really is just mostly defining what we're doing in a really, really basic form. So what's government? Government is just the institution that decides how society makes and enforces its public policies. So what are public policies? Could be anything that a government decides to do. So if you think about like what we're doing has been prescribed by the state of Oklahoma, not necessarily the United States federal or national government, but it could be what laws a local municipality has, or a federal law, laws that could be broken, that you could be put in jail for or pay a fine for, all the way to healthcare. Those are all public policies that are created by our government. And governments have to have the power to carry out public policy. And that could be preventing something from happening or making sure that something does happen. And it's, that's really what it means, the ability to achieve the desired end. What's the outcome? So, we're kind of fast tracking here, but in my classes, we talk about, we use the word state a lot in the way that we talk with like the state of Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is not really a state in the most complete sense of the definition. When we talk about states in government, especially if you go to college and they talk about states, they're talking about countries. And so when we talk about the 4 basic theories as to the origin of the state, we're talking about really how we kind of ended up in terms of what we have today. And there are 4. And so we're going to talk about them real basically. The first one is the force theory. This is where one person or group claims that they have control over an area through force or even threat of force. And the next one is the evolutionary theory, whereas the states developed from the early families. So if you think about Native America before European contact, or even Africa before European contact, most of those governments were what we would call tribal or familial in some manner, and they kind of grew out of these primitive circumstances into what we would call governments. The next one is the divine right theory. Probably the greatest example of that is Louis XIV. This theory states that God or some kind of religious figure gives those of royal birth a divine right to rule. And it's for us, it seems kind of strange. But the people are obligated to obey them because of their religion. So if they have a very deep belief in their faith, and they're tied to that divine ruler, that's tremendous power. And we really kind of started to see a lot of that start to crumble or go away in the late 18th century or the late 1700s. And then the last one of those is really just a kind of a combination of those theories, which I didn't list. The book doesn't list, but we kind of arrived at all of those, and that would be basically the social contract theory. And it may have gotten moved around in these slides, and we'll come back to that one. But all governments in basic form have 3 basic powers: legislative, judicial, and executive. Legislative just means they have the power to make laws and determine public policy, which we talked a little bit about. Executive means that they have the power to execute those laws or enforce and administer those laws, to carry them out. The judicial has the power to interpret laws, and a lot of governments, this kind of takes a back seat to the other two, legislative and executive. Judicial kind of takes a third row seat. In our government, they are a co-equal branch with the first two. They have the power to interpret laws and determine their meaning, and then settle disputes between either the state and somebody that's been accused of a crime, or even two citizens in a civil manner. We're going to talk a little bit more about this on Thursday in our next PowerPoint, or if we use this again, it might not be on a Thursday, it might be on any other day. But we really define our types of governments in two really, really basic ways, and that is dictatorship. And, a lot of times people think of dictatorship and they think of just one individual, but you could think of even, if you think of today, a lot of people would say the classic example would be North Korea. And their official title in the world is the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which they're in no way, shape, or form a democracy or a republic. They are ruled by a pretty iron-fisted, militaristic dictator. But if you look at a country like Russia, Russia, basically tells the world that they have free and open elections, which they really don't. They're ruled by Vladimir Putin and a very small group of what we would call oligarchs. And these oligarchs have a lot of money. They have ties to extreme wealth, maybe oil. Many of them are tied to oil. But the people really don't have much of a say in Russia, even though they classify themselves as a republic or a democracy. And so they fall into that category of dictatorship. So you look at the true democracies in the world, and they even have their problems. If you look at France and England and Canada and the United States and Japan, these are all democracies. These are all where the real power behind the government lies with the people. And that's what that second definition says. Supreme authority rests with the people. Do we have problems in our democracy? Absolutely. Are there kind of sometimes walls between the ruling authorities and the people? Absolutely. But that's one of the reasons why we kind of go through this, to kind of demonstrate that it's not perfect. So, and I think I talked about this when we talk about states. Oklahoma is not technically a state, but when we talk about states, they're a little bit different than the type that we're typically talking about in terms of global government. Oklahoma is not technically a state in the true sense of the word, even though we call it a state. But a state has the power to make and enforce law without the consent of any higher authority. So if you think about that, for the most part, Oklahoma can do that. But there are certain things they can't do in terms of the higher authority would be the federal government. So Oklahoma can't, for instance, they can't coin money. They can't create a post office or anything like that. There are limitations to what they can do. States have to have a population, and we're talking about countries again, or states. But states must have a population. In general terms, a state must have people to occupy it. The smallest of these is San Marino, which is surrounded by on all sides by Italy. They only have about 30,000 people, but they're considered to be a state because they have a population and meet the other classifications. One of the biggest would be China, if not the biggest, and it's between China and India. But you're talking about, between China and India, you're talking about populations that are well over 1 billion people. And so you've got a variety of classifications in terms of population. Territory is, for the most part, land with borders. And there are borders, there are places in the world where we say that, India, and the perfect example is India and Pakistan. They have a disputed border between those two countries. But regardless of that, they still have territory. They have land that they occupy, and even though they have a disputed border between those two countries, we still consider those countries or states. The last of these is sovereignty. And sovereignty is something that we have a lot of different definitions in this country, because we have a federal government which has a collection of 50 states. And then even within our country, we have a number of what I would call semi-sovereign countries like Indian nations. So if you think about, and Oklahoma is kind of the perfect example. If you think about, like, Ottawa County has 9 recognized tribes, federally recognized tribes that occupy one county. Well, they're continually working for sovereignty. Oklahoma City hosts a sovereignty kind of what they call a symposium every single year. Well, these tribes aren't truly sovereign. They don't meet that criteria of that they don't answer to any kind of higher authority. They're continually negotiating with the state of Oklahoma in terms of casinos, and they're continually negotiating with the United States federal government on certain things in terms of land. So they don't really fall into that category, even though they typically tend to fight for sovereignty. But sovereignty just means that within a territory, the government that controls that territory doesn't answer to anybody else. Okay? Government is every state or country is politically organized, and that means that all of them have some sort of government. This is the agency through which the state exerts its will and works to accomplish its goals. And that sounds kind of heavy-handed, but at the end of the day, that's really pretty much what it means. And this is the one, I guess this was a misplaced, I must have been clicking around when I did this, but this is the last of those theories. The social contract theory was kind of a combination of a lot of these, but the social contract theory of the origin of the state, the perfect example is us, the United States. You think of Thomas Hobbes and Harrington and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They all helped develop this theory that it basically means that a group of people give up some of their rights in order to have some of their others protected and enforced by their government. And we do that in the United States. We allow ourselves to be governed by the federal government, but we also, as part of that contract, expect that our government is going to provide protection. They're going to provide education. And that goes all the way from the federal government down to the local governments. If you think about, at Claremore High School, if we have a fire in our building and we call 911, there's an expectation that the government's going to arrive in the form of a fire department and put that fire out and protect us and help us be safe. But this is a voluntary act where the people agree to certain conditions in terms of being governed, but they also give up certain things. In our country, we don't give up a lot. We have an amazing range of freedom in terms of speech and mobility. We're not limited in terms of where we can live other than maybe financially. But this is one of those things that when you start looking at how our country developed, you can look directly to the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence from Great Britain argues that King George III violated this contract, that a lot of the grievances that we complained about weren't being addressed by Parliament in England or King George III at all. Okay, so we pick up with, what's the purpose of government? And in our government classes, we point to the preamble of the Constitution. That really, our preamble covers the idea of why anyone would want a government. So at this point, I'd like for you to pause and just read the preamble, and then we'll pick up with what each part means in just a second. And this is, obviously we had, if you remember from American history, we've had 2 governments. We had our first government was under what we called the Articles of Confederation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that probably in the next PowerPoint. But the 13 original colonies would come together to form the first government of the United States. And although the Constitution as we know it is the second form of government in our country, it still exists. The Constitution that we had then still exists and thrives today, although it faces a lot of challenges. So what does it mean to establish justice? We've determined as a country that impartial justice must be reasonable, fair, and impartial. And that's something that we strive to. I've tried to think about how to word this, in terms of this slide. Is that the case today? Not always. When you look at, there's certain aspects of our justice system that aren't reasonable and fair sometimes. But we're always working to improve it. And we try to make it as good as we can possibly make it. Domestic tranquility is just keeping the peace, keeping order. Without it, we don't have it. Anarchy. Anarchy is basically the absence of order or the absence of government. And this keeps the unlawful, the people that would take advantage of no rules, it keeps them in check. Providing for the common defense, I kind of talked about that, but this aspect is mentioned far more than any other concept in the Constitution. In our world today, we don't only guard against possible violent actions by other countries. So if you think about like 9/11, the attacks on September 11th in 2001, that was a violent attack against our country by a terrorist group. But we're facing digital attacks in the form of election hacking and things like that. And we have government agencies that their very duty is to protect us against those things. The general welfare protects you in a lot of ways that you sometimes maybe not even consider. And at this point in your life, you're thinking, oh, I don't think public schools are. But public schools are part of that. Public schools, the roads that you drive on, the food that's inspected by the Food and Drug Administration, the water that's tested by, if you're on rural water or if you're on the Claremore City water. These are all government protections that are there for you. But also, the perfect example is right now, in terms of where we are with the pandemic. That's a global pandemic, in terms of the coronavirus. And many of our states in the United States have declared states of emergency where they're limiting social gatherings. They've canceled school. But this is also something that can be addressed by the federal government, typically through the President of the United States. They can declare a state of emergency. They can quarantine people, which means they are very limited on what they can do and where they can go. So there's things that are in place to promote what we're talking about. Securing the blessings of liberty, these are the protections of our freedoms from our government. In other words, and that's a great quote that I always like to use with my kids, that those that are willing to give up even just a little bit of liberty in order to obtain a little temporary safety, they don't deserve either. In other words, we always have to guard against. It's very easy for the government to say, well, this is an emergency. 9/11 was an emergency. We're going to limit things like free speech. No, you don't have to limit things in order to allow for protections. And you're always going to have government entities that are going to argue against that. But that's kind of your job as a citizen, is to say, no. I don't want you to take away, free speech or my freedom of religion or my right to bear arms or whatever it is, in order to protect from some kind of national crisis, whether it's a foreign government or within. And I'm kind of showing my bias here, but I think Franklin had it right. He was someone that valued liberty even in times of real danger. Our freedoms and liberties are among the greatest in the world. We have to work to protect them all the time. And however, they cannot infringe on the liberties or freedoms of others. So, in other words, my freedoms extend to the point where they might infringe on someone else. I don't have the right or the ability to infringe on somebody else's rights or freedoms. But it's our duty to guard against our government if they're trying to take away those things, even in a time of crisis. And I think that's it for today. So I hope I didn't ramble too much. We will pick up with Section 2, and we'll do a little bit more of an overview of Section 2, and we really won't cover Section 3 at all in Chapter 1 of the book. And we will post everything. Coach Green and I will post everything on our Google Classroom so that you've got access to it. And we'll talk to you soon.